The moment I stepped inside, I felt like Alice stumbling into Wonderland. Everything was glittering. Gold walls, chandeliers that sparkled like captured starlight, and sleek leather booths that looked too perfect to touch. The music thumped gently under my feet, and a soft haze hung in the air, glowing faintly blue. People glided around me like swans on a lake, each one dressed like they had their own fairy godmother on speed dial. It was the kind of place that made me want to find a mirror just to check if I looked out of place. Spoiler, I did. I headed for the bar, feeling like Cinderella in her pre-magic dress. My old trench coat and camera bag felt heavier than usual, like they wanted to sink me into the polished floor. Still, I slid onto a stool, half hoping the bartender might produce a glass slipper instead of a cocktail. "What'll it be, miss?" the bartender asked with a polite smile. I fumbled. "Something strong?" That's when I saw him. He was leaning against the far end of the bar, a tall figure with a suit that looked like it had been spun from midnight itself. His hair was dark, just brushing his collar, and when he turned to me, his eyes gleamed silver. His lips curved into a smile, the kind that could make you forget your own name if you weren't careful. He strolled over, his footsteps too smooth to be real. "I don't believe we've met," he said. His voice was velvet and mischief all at once. "Lucien Moreau, owner of this little oasis, and you are—" I blinked. "Cass Darrow." He tilted his head, eyes catching the light like coins at the bottom of a well. "Cass Darrow," he repeated slowly, as if tasting the words. "A pleasure. I don't think I've seen you here before. I don't think I've ever been anywhere like here before," I said, my words tumbling out faster than I intended. His smile deepened, but his gaze flicked down to my camera bag and the worn press badge pinned to my coat. "A journalist," he murmured. "So, you came to the eclipse looking for what, exactly?" I hesitated, suddenly feeling like I'd walked into a trap made of silk and charm. "Just a drink, something to take my mind off things." Lucien nodded, his smile never faltering. "Ah, a fellow seeker of distractions. Well, Miss Darrow, I do hope you find what you are looking for." He raised his glass in a toast, then walked away, leaving me feeling like I'd just stepped off a spinning carousel. I sat there, staring after him, wondering if I'd just been welcomed or warned. I sipped the drink in front of me, the ice clinking softly against the glass. The club buzzed with life, laughter bubbling up from clusters of elegant patrons, heels clicking on the marble floors. I tried to keep my eyes on my glass, but my ears were working overtime. Eavesdropping, you might call it, but I considered it research. From my corner seat at the bar, I caught snippets of conversations, a couple whispering about a scandalous art auction, a man bragging about his exclusive watch collection. But one voice, low and urgent, cut through the noise like a needle through silk. I leaned back, careful not to turn my head. The sound came from a shadowy alcove just behind me. "The men won't stand for it," a man hissed. "The council won't let the gathering go ahead without—" "Shh," another voice snapped. "You never know who's listening." I glanced down at my cocktail napkin and discreetly pulled a pen from my bag. Pretending to fiddle with my drink, I jotted down what I'd just heard. My handwriting wobbled with the nervous energy that buzzed through my fingers. Council? Gathering? It was cryptic enough to spark my curiosity and vague enough to feel dangerous. The words were barely written when a loud crash turned every head toward the dance floor. I whipped around to see a hulking man holding another by the lapels, lifting him clean off the ground. The smaller guy struggled, his feet dangling a good foot above the polished floor. The crowd around them scattered, clearing a wide space. It wasn't just the display of strength that made me gasp. It was the sheer speed of it. One second they were dancing, the next they were at each other's throats. Before I could process what I was seeing, Lucien appeared. I didn't even see him approach. He was just there, his presence somehow calming, yet commanding. He placed a hand on the larger man's shoulder, and though I couldn't hear what he said, the effect was immediate. The man dropped his would-be victim, his shoulders slumping like a deflated balloon. The smaller man straightened his jacket and slipped into the crowd without a word. The tension evaporated as quickly as it had formed, leaving only the pulsing rhythm of the music in its wake. My heart thudded against my ribs as Lucien turned and glided back toward the bar. He stopped at my stool, his silver-gray eyes locking onto mine. For a moment, I felt like a moth caught in a beam of moonlight. "I hope that didn't ruin your evening," he said, his voice as smooth as his movements. "Allow me to replace your drink." I blinked, struggling to recover. "Oh, no, it's fine. I was just..." "What, writing down cryptic overheard whispers? Staring like a starstruck tourist? I'm fine, really." He tilted his head, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You should come back another night," he said, his tone casual, but his eyes seemed to carry another message entirely. "That's when things truly come alive around here." My lips parted, but no words came out. Before I could figure out what to say, he turned and disappeared into the crowd once again. I glanced down at the napkin in my hand, the messy scrawl of notes, and realized two things. I'd barely touched my drink, and I was in way over my head. The office smelled faintly of old coffee and pine-scented air freshener. Agatha's desk was exactly as I remembered it. Piles of case files leaning like tiny towers, a framed photo of her dog front and center, and a steaming cup of tea balanced precariously on top of a battered legal pad. She looked up as I walked in, her sharp brown eyes narrowing with a mix of curiosity and caution. "Ass," she said, setting her pen down. "This must be serious. You don't usually come all the way out here unless something's got you spooked." "Spooked might be an understatement," I replied, sliding into the chair opposite her. "I've been somewhere different." She leaned back, folding her arms across her neatly pressed blazer. "I'm listening." "So," I told her about the eclipse, the glowing neon, the golden walls, and the people who moved like they owned the air they breathed. I described the low voices I'd overheard, whispering about the council and the gathering. And then I told her about the fight, how the man had pinned the other to the wall like he was made of paper, and how Lucien, this too-perfect club owner, had diffused it all with a single look and a few murmured words. Agatha didn't blink as I spoke. She just watched me, her face a careful, blank slate. When I finished, she reached for her tea, blowing lightly across the surface before taking a sip. "Well," she said at last, setting the cup down, "that sounds unusual." "Unusual? That's all you've got." I couldn't help but laugh. "I just described what felt like a scene from a supernatural thriller, and you're calling it unusual?" She shrugged one shoulder. "You know me, I don't jump to conclusions, but..." She tapped her fingers on the desk. "I'll admit this Lucien character sounds interesting, and I don't like the sound of this council business. If it's some sort of underground group, it's worth looking into." "So you'll help me?" I asked, leaning forward. I could feel the tension in my shoulders relax, just a bit. Agatha nodded slowly. "I'll do a little digging, see if there's anything on this Lucien Moreau, anything on the club, but I'm not making any promises. And Cass, she leveled a look at me that only Agatha could pull off, firm but laced with concern. Be careful. If there's a deeper story here, there's a reason they've kept it quiet. You can't waltz in like a knight in shining armor. This isn't a fairy tale. Funny, I said with a small smile. It felt like one? She snorted, grabbing her pen again. A fairy tale with teeth, maybe. As I left her office, the chilly evening air hit me, and I realized I had no idea what I was getting into. But at least I wasn't walking into it alone. Agatha always knew how to ground me, how to make the impossible seem manageable. At least, for the moment. So, I said, letting out a long breath, what's the next step? How do we figure out what's really going on at that place? Agatha leaned back in her chair, the springs creaking softly. She steepled her fingers under her chin and gave me one of her trademark thinking looks. Eyebrows pinched, lips pursed, the kind of look that usually meant I was about to be told something I didn't want to hear. You keep going, she said simply. I blinked. Excuse me? You keep going to the eclipse, she repeated, waving a hand as if it were obvious. Whatever this gathering is, whatever Lucien's up to, he'll let his guard down sooner or later, and you'll be there, sipping your overpriced drink, listening, watching, and taking notes on napkins. I stared at her. That's your plan? I keep showing up and hope they don't notice I'm scribbling in the corner? She smirked. Well, I didn't say it was a perfect plan. And what about you? I asked. What are you going to do while I'm hanging out in a den of possible supernatural activity? She straightened up, reaching for her notepad. I'll do what I do best. Dig into their pasts. Lucien Moreau, the club's management, that council you mentioned, I'll pull records, look for connections, see if any names pop up in old cases. If they've been keeping secrets, I'll find them. I nodded slowly. So I play the undercover socialite, and you play the brilliant detective. Exactly, she said, picking up her pen and jotting something down. Just don't get yourself kicked out or, heaven forbid, thrown out. I need you inside to keep the pressure on. I couldn't help but laugh. Agatha Marple, you really know how to make me feel indispensable. Someone's got to keep you out of trouble, she replied, her tone light, but her eyes sharp. And someone's got to get to the bottom of this. We each have our part. You in? I sighed, a mix of anxiety and excitement bubbling in my chest. I'm in. Good, she said, already flipping through a folder. Now go practice looking like you belong in a nightclub. And just like that, we had a plan. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours. The moment I stepped back into the eclipse, I felt it. The air was different, thicker, heavier, as if it was charged with some kind of invisible electricity. The usual glitz and glamour were still there. Golden walls, sparkling chandeliers, and that soft blue haze swirling in the air. But tonight, something else lingered beneath the surface. It wasn't just a nightclub anymore. It was something alive, something waiting. I tugged at the hem of my jacket and forced a casual expression, the kind you'd wear when you wanted people to think you belonged. But as I looked around, I couldn't shake the feeling that I stood out like a smudge on a polished mirror. The patrons were as dazzling as ever. Every man looked like he'd stepped out of a fashion magazine, and every woman could have passed for royalty. Their skin seemed too smooth, their movements too graceful. I told myself I was imagining it, but deep down, I knew I wasn't. These weren't just rich socialites. They were something else. I made my way through the crowd, clutching a glass of sparkling water I didn't plan to drink. My eyes scanned the room, landing on faces, gestures, movements. And then I saw him, a tall man in a sleek black suit, his sharp cheekbones catching the light. I recognized him instantly. He was one of the men I'd overheard whispering about the council the other night. My pulse quickened as I adjusted my path, pretending to be captivated by the golden decor while edging closer to him. He stood near a velvet-draped corner, speaking in low, hurried tones to another man. I caught snippets of their conversation, but the words weren't in English, or any language I'd ever heard. It was fluid, melodic, and almost hypnotic, like a song that wanted to pull you under. I leaned against the bar nearby, pretending to scroll through my phone, while my ears strained for clues. As I glanced up, something happened that made my breath catch. The first man's eyes flickered, literally flickered in the dim light. For a split second, they glowed a pale, eerie silver, like the reflection of the moon on still water. The other man responded, his voice low and calm, and then his eyes did the same, briefly lighting up, as if they shared some kind of signal. My heart skipped. I was definitely not imagining things. I shifted, careful not to draw attention to myself. The two men seemed deep in conversation, their words still flowing in that strange, otherworldly tongue. Whatever they were discussing, it was serious, urgent, and I was sure it had nothing to do with overpriced cocktails or the latest gossip. For a moment, I considered getting closer, maybe even sneaking my phone out to record them. But then the taller man's gaze flicked across the room and landed right on me. I froze. His silver eyes narrowed slightly, as if he'd caught me in the act of something I hadn't yet done. My mind raced, and before I could panic, I gave him a small, polite smile and quickly turned my attention to my drink, pretending to be utterly fascinated by the bubbles. "Blend in, Cass," I told myself. "Blend in or get out." The conversation behind me faded, and when I glanced back, both men were gone. The velvet corner was empty, as if they'd never been there at all. My stomach churned with a mix of fear and excitement. I had no idea what I'd just witnessed, but one thing was clear. This club wasn't just a playground for the rich and glamorous. It was something far more dangerous, and I had to find out what. I barely had time to process what I'd just seen when I felt a hand on my shoulder. It wasn't a light touch. It was firm, deliberate, the kind that made it clear whoever it belonged to wasn't asking for permission. My heart jumped, but I forced myself to turn around slowly, schooling my face into an innocent expression. And there he was, Lucien Moreau. "Miss Darrow," he said smoothly, his silver eyes locking onto mine. His voice was calm, almost playful, but there was an edge beneath it, like a knife hidden in velvet. "Enjoying yourself?" "Of course," I replied, my tone just as light. "Great music, interesting crowd, what's not to enjoy?" His lips curved into a smile, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I noticed you've been observing," he said, his hand still resting on my shoulder. "It's a wonderful habit for a journalist. But in places like this, curiosity can be risky." My stomach did a little flip, but I kept my cool. "Risky?" I repeated with a laugh, pretending I didn't feel the chill that crept down my spine. "You make it sound like I've stumbled into a spy movie." "Perhaps you have," he said, his voice dropping just slightly, enough to make my breath hitch. "Or perhaps you're simply asking questions that don't have answers." His hand slid off my shoulder as he leaned closer, his tone as smooth as silk. "Either way, I'd hate for you to waste your evening worrying about the wrong things. The eclipse is meant to be enjoyed, not analyzed." I raised an eyebrow, tilting my head as if I were considering his words. "Well, that's good advice," I said, smiling brightly. "I'll try to remember that." "Do," he replied, straightening up. "And while you're here, do me a favor. Relax. Have another drink. Let the night sweep you away." His words were charming, his smile flawless, but his eyes were watching me too closely. He wasn't just warning me, he was sizing me up, looking for cracks in my armor. "Thanks for the tip," I said, lifting my glass in a mock toast. "I'll do my best." With that, he gave me a small nod and melted back into the crowd as if he'd never been there. I watched him go, my heart pounding in my chest, but my mind sharper than ever. Lucian wanted me to stop asking questions. He wanted me to play dumb, to look the other way, to pretend this was just another fancy club filled with fancy people. But I wasn't going to stop. If anything, his warning just made me more determined. Whatever secrets the eclipse was hiding, I was going to uncover them, no matter how dangerous it got. It was amazing how easily one overheard comment could flip your whole night upside down. As I casually sipped another drink, well, I held the glass. I hadn't taken more than a sip just in case. I caught the word gathering. Two impeccably dressed men stood a few feet away, their voices low but not quite low enough. "Everyone's here for the gathering tonight," one murmured. "Basement level," the other whispered back. "You know how to get in?" I froze, my glass hovering just below my lips. The gathering, that word again. My mind raced. If it was happening here tonight, I had to see it. I had to know what was so secret, so forbidden, that people only whispered about it in corners. But how? I didn't exactly have an invitation, and asking someone outright would be like waving a neon sign over my head that said, "I don't belong here." Then I noticed the steward, young, sharp, and preoccupied, hurrying past with a tray of empty glasses. My plan wasn't exactly the stuff of spy novels, but it was all I had. I accidentally bumped into him, causing the glasses on his tray to wobble dangerously. "Oops, sorry," I said, reaching out as if I were going to help steady them. As he scrambled to save the tray, I discreetly slipped the security badge hanging from his belt. "No problem," he muttered, giving me a distracted smile before moving on. With the badge tucked into my palm, I headed toward the back of the club, following the faint hum of voices and the flicker of lights that seemed to lead downward. I was nearly there when I encountered a very large man in a dark suit stationed near the basement door. He wasn't just big, he was imposing. His presence felt heavier than it should, like he could crush you with a look. And that's when it hit me. He wasn't just looking at me, he was sniffing. His nostrils flared, his head tilted slightly. It was as if he could smell the nerves rolling off me, or worse, the fact that I wasn't supposed to be there. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks, and I took a slow, deliberate step forward, forcing a smile. "Evening," I said, keeping my voice light. He said nothing, just stared. For a long, long moment, I thought I was caught. Then his attention shifted, his sharp gaze moving to someone else behind me. Without a second thought, I slipped the badge into the scanner and slid through the door. I let out a shaky breath as I stepped inside. The basement was nothing like the club above. Where the main floor glittered like a fairy tale, this place felt like a Gothic cathedral. Stone walls stretched high into the shadows, lit by flickering sconces. A long, dark wooden table dominated the center of the room, its surface carved with intricate patterns that seemed to shift when the light hit them. Around it sat figures cloaked in darkness. At first glance, they looked like ordinary people, stylish, beautiful, untouchable. But as I watched, my stomach tightened. Their movements were too smooth, too deliberate. One man leaned into the light, just enough for me to catch the gleam of fangs. Another's hand briefly shifted into something claw-like before he tucked it back into his lap. I pressed myself against the wall, my breath catching in my throat. Vampires, werewolves, and who knew what else. This was the gathering. I was sure of it. Now, all I had to do was figure out what they were planning and get out of here in one piece. I stayed glued to the shadows, barely daring to breathe. The room was filled with creatures straight out of the kind of story I'd never believed could be real. They were talking now. Low, measured voices that carried a dangerous kind of weight. "The council's time is over," one of them said. His voice was as smooth as velvet, but the sharp edge underneath made me shiver. "Lucian has the vision, the strength. We follow him, and we build a future without their rules." A murmur of agreement rippled around the table. I could feel the tension in the air, thick enough to choke on. "And they think they can keep us under their thumb forever," another voice added. "But Lucien has already taken the first steps. He's already shown us that power belongs to those who dare to take it." I had to swallow the lump in my throat. The council. There it was again. Whoever they were, these creatures weren't just meeting to share cocktails and gossip. They were planning a rebellion, a takeover. And Lucien? He was their would-be king. I fumbled in my pocket for my phone, my fingers trembling. I set it to record and held it low, keeping it just out of sight. If I got caught, I had no idea what they'd do to me. But if I didn't get this on tape, I'd have nothing to show Agatha. Nothing to prove what I'd seen. "Lucien's leadership will unite us," the first voice continued. "The council doesn't understand us. They never have. They're old, stuck in their ways. Lucian will bring the change we need." Someone else leaned forward, their face momentarily lit by the flicker of the chandelier above. Their eyes glinted, bright and unnatural, like a predator. "When do we strike?" The first voice replied. "Patience, my friend. We're almost ready." My heart hammered so loudly I thought they might hear it. I stopped the recording, slipped the phone back into my pocket, and took one last look. The table was alive with whispers, plans, and promises of something big, something dangerous. I didn't stick around to hear the rest. I turned and slipped out the way I came, my pulse racing as I climbed the stairs. The music from the main floor hit me like a wave, drowning out the voices from below. My legs felt shaky, but I forced myself to walk, slowly, casually, back into the glittering, golden room. I had what I came for. Now I just needed to figure out what it all meant and how I was going to survive telling anyone. Agatha's office was brighter than usual when I stepped inside. The sunlight filtered through her blinds in sharp beams, landing on the tidy stacks of papers on her desk. She didn't look up right away. Instead, she was flipping through a manila folder, her lips pressed into a hard, thin line. The warm greeting I was expecting never came. "Hey," I said, holding up my phone like a prize. "Wait until you hear this. I've got a recorded..." "Yes?" Her voice was calm, but the kind of calm that told you a storm was coming. I froze mid-step, lowering my phone. "What's wrong?" She closed the folder and finally looked at me. Her brown eyes, normally filled with sharp humor or cautious encouragement, were dead serious. "You need to sit down." I hesitated, then sat in the chair opposite her desk, my pulse starting to pick up speed. "What's going on?" "Sure." Agatha slid the folder across the desk. "This showed up this morning. Officially, I'm not supposed to let you see it, but you have the right to know." I opened it, my hand suddenly clammy. Inside were several photos of me, at the eclipse, on the street outside, even one from a few days ago when I was at a coffee shop. My stomach twisted as I flipped to the next page. There was a report linking me to several missing persons cases. It listed dates, locations, and one sentence that made my head spin. Subject was seen entering the nightclub with the victims on multiple occasions. "Wait," I stammered, looking up at Agatha. "This is a mistake. I don't even know these people." "I know that," she said, her voice low. "But the evidence says otherwise. Witness statements, security footage, it's all there." I felt like the floor had tilted under me. "You don't think Of course not," she snapped, cutting me off. "I know you, Cass. You're many things, but you're not a kidnapper. Or worse. Someone set you up. They want you out of the way." "Someone from the club," I said, the realization dawning on me. "Lucien? Or someone close to him. He must have known I was poking around, so he's trying to scare me off." Agatha nodded grimly. "It's possible, and if it's not him, it's someone who doesn't want you anywhere near this gathering or this council business." My breath came faster, my mind racing. What do I do now? "For starters, you keep your head down," Agatha said, leaning forward. "You're being followed, Cass. I've seen the same faces too many times to call it a coincidence. Someone's watching your every move, and if you don't stop poking the bear, they'll make sure you never poke anything again." I swallowed hard, my excitement from earlier now a heavy knot in my chest. "So what? I just back off and let them win?" "No," she said firmly. "But you have to be smart about it. I'll see what I can do to poke holes in this case. You keep a low profile and think carefully before you take your next step. Understand?" I nodded slowly, the weight of the situation pressing down on me. I had proof, sure, but now I had something even more pressing. A target on my back. I stared at the photos on Agatha's desk, my stomach churning. My face was in every one, paired with people I'd never met, tied to crimes I hadn't committed. Someone wanted me gone. Someone wanted me silenced. But here's the thing about me. I don't walk away when things get messy. I lean in. "This is garbage," I said, slamming the folder shut. "Whoever put this together, they're trying to scare me off. I can't let them win." "Madam," Agatha started, but I held up a hand. "I know what you're going to say. Stay low, lay low, let you handle it. But if I back down now, they'll think they've won, and they'll come after me again the next time I get too close. I have to prove this is all fake. I have to find out who's behind it." "And how are you planning to do that?" Agatha asked, crossing her arms. "Now, these people have resources, connections. They've set you up so cleanly that even I can't pick it apart right away. What makes you think you'll get anywhere?" "Because they made a mistake," I said, holding up my phone. "They didn't count on me already having proof that something's going on. If they're this desperate to shut me up, it means I'm onto something big, and if I keep digging, I'll find the crack in their story." Agatha shook her head, clearly torn. "Cass, this isn't a movie. You're not some plucky detective who can outwit the bad guys in 2 hours. These people play dirty, and if you're not careful, you're going to end up in a place you can't get out of." I gave her a tight smile. "You're right. This isn't a movie, which is why I'm not waiting for a dramatic twist. I'm going to be smart about it. I'll watch my back, I'll move carefully, but I'm not going to let them scare me off. If they think I'm just going to roll over, they don't know who they're dealing with." Agatha sighed, running a hand over her face. "You're impossible. You know that?" "I've been told." I stood, tucking my phone back in my pocket. "But thanks for worrying. I'll be careful, promise. Just "Don't do anything stupid, all right?" she said, giving me a look that was half exasperation, half concern. "No promises," I said with a grin, heading for the door. But as soon as I stepped outside, the grin faded. The sun felt colder than it should have, and every stranger on the street felt like a potential shadow. I didn't need Agatha to tell me that I was in real danger, but that danger only made me more determined. I wasn't going to stop until I had the truth. I wasn't going to stop until my name was clear. Agatha didn't waste time. The moment she got the lead on her informant, she was on them like a dog on a bone. She didn't bring me along, said it was better if I stayed out of sight for now. And frankly, after seeing her in action, I understood why. She caught up with them in a diner, one of those all-night spots with flickering fluorescent lights and the smell of burnt coffee in the air. Agatha didn't even bother ordering. She slid into the booth across from the informant, fixed them with her no-nonsense gaze, and said, "We need to talk." "Detective Marple," the informant replied, their voice wavering just slightly. "What's this about?" "You know what it's about." Agatha pulled a folded piece of paper from her pocket and placed it on the table. "Cass Darrow, missing persons cases, surveillance footage. You want to tell me why her name keeps coming up?" The informant blinked, then quickly shook their head. "I don't know what you mean. I haven't." "Save it," Agatha cut in. Her voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, sharp enough to slice through their excuses. "You're the only one who had access to this information. Either you're working with Lucien, or you've got something to hide. Which is it?" They hesitated, their fingers drumming nervously against the table. "I didn't have a choice," they finally said, their voice dropping to a whisper. "You don't understand. They got to me." Agatha leaned forward. "Who's they?" The informant glanced around, then leaned in closer. "Lucien's people. They came to me months ago, said they knew things about my past, things I'd rather keep buried. They threatened to expose me if I didn't help them." "You framed her," Agatha said flatly. "You made it look like she was involved." "No," the informant protested, shaking their head. "They had everything planned already. I just passed along a few details, gave them enough to build their story. They needed someone human, someone they could throw under the bus if things got messy. And Cass was the perfect target," Agatha said, her tone sharp. "She had no idea what she was walking into, did she?" The informant's face fell, guilt etched into every line. "No, she didn't. They knew she'd start asking questions, knew she couldn't resist digging deeper. They set the trap, and I helped them spring it." Agatha leaned back, her eyes narrowing. "So this was all Lucien's idea. He's the one pulling the strings." The informant nodded reluctantly. "He's not just the owner of that club. He's got connections, powerful connections. And if you think he's just going to let this go, let me worry about that," Agatha said, cutting them off. "You just keep yourself out of trouble, because if I find out you've lied to me again, I won't be so understanding next time." The informant swallowed hard, nodded, and quickly left the diner, leaving Agatha sitting there with that familiar, thoughtful expression on her face. I could almost hear her voice in my head, one step closer. I caught up with Agatha at her office that evening, and she looked like she'd been working some kind of magic. Papers were spread across her desk, and she was on the phone murmuring in that low, clipped tone she used when she was prying something out of a reluctant source. When she hung up, she turned to me, her face set in that sharp, determined expression I'd come to trust. "Well," I asked, leaning against her desk, "what did you get?" She smirked. "More than they thought I could, that's for sure." Our informant may not be the sharpest knife in the drawer, but once you press the right button, they spill like a knocked-over coffee cup." I raised my eyebrows. And, she said, leaning back in her chair, "Lucien isn't as untouchable as he thinks. He's been stashing his little insurance policies in a private room behind the club's wine cellar. It's not on the blueprints, and it's guarded by someone who doesn't exactly clock out at the end of a shift." "A private room?" I echoed, feeling a flicker of hope. "What kind of insurance policies are we talking about? Documents, recordings, anything he can use to keep people in line or cover his tracks. From what I gather, there's a whole collection in there that could blow his operation wide open. And it just so happens," she added with a small, satisfied smile, "there's more than enough in there to prove you're not the one behind those disappearances." I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. "So you're saying, if I can get in there—" "If we can get in there," Agatha corrected me, "you'll have what you need to clear your name, and I might just have enough to start pulling at the threads Lucien's been so carefully tying together." It wasn't a promise, but it was the closest thing to hope I'd felt in days. Agatha had done what she did best: find the trail, no matter how well it was hidden. Now it was up to us to follow it. I didn't find out what happened until much later, after Agatha finally called me. Her voice was shaky, and that alone sent a jolt of worry through my chest. Agatha didn't do shaky. She'd gone back to the informant after our meeting. She thought it'd be simple: get them out of the diner and to a safer place, somewhere they wouldn't be tempted to run off or turn coat again. But the moment they stepped outside, things went sideways. It was quiet at first, just the usual hum of traffic and the flicker of the diner's neon sign. Agatha was a step ahead, her eyes scanning the street for any sign of trouble. The informant walked close behind her, head down and hands stuffed in their coat pockets. They didn't see it coming. The first strike came from the shadows, quick, silent, and terrifyingly precise. Agatha heard the whoosh of air before the informant stumbled forward, gasping. She turned just in time to see a figure, face hidden, retracting something glinting in the faint light. A blade, maybe. "Run!" Agatha barked, shoving the informant toward the alley. But their steps faltered. Agatha barely had time to react before the attacker struck again. This time, the informant went down hard. Agatha tried to fight back. She always carried something, a flashlight, pepper spray, just in case. She managed to land a blow, enough to force the attacker to retreat momentarily, but it was clear she was outmatched. She darted into the alley, her breath ragged, as the assailant faded into the darkness. When she finally called me, she spoke in clipped sentences, her usual confidence buried beneath layers of urgency and frustration. "The informant's gone, Cass," she said flatly. "They didn't make it. Whoever came after us wasn't messing around. They wanted to send a message." My stomach dropped. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," she replied, though her tone said otherwise. But this just got a whole lot more dangerous. She hung up before I could ask any more questions. I sat there staring at my phone, my mind racing. Agatha was alive, but just barely, and now we were one informant and one lead short. The night had come. My stomach churned as we approached the eclipse once again. The golden glow from the entrance felt colder now, more like a trap than a welcome. Agatha walked beside me, calm as ever, her sharp eyes scanning every corner. "Last chance to back out," she said with a faint smirk, not even looking at me. I shook my head, forcing a smile. "And let you have all the fun? Not a chance." This time we weren't sneaking in. We weren't just a pair of nosy humans poking around a world we didn't belong in. Tonight we were walking in like we owned the place, armed with enough evidence to blow Lucien's carefully built house of cards to pieces. The secret gathering was already in full swing when we slipped into the back room. The table was surrounded again. Vampires with their cold, predatory gazes, werewolves lounging like they were waiting for a hunt, and others I couldn't even begin to identify. And there at the head of the table was Lucien. He looked as sharp and composed as ever, but his eyes narrowed slightly when he saw us. "Miss Darrow," he said smoothly, his voice cutting through the low hum of conversation, "and Detective Marple, to what do we owe the pleasure?" I stepped forward before Agatha could say anything. "We're here because your little game is over, Lucien." I pulled out my phone and hit play. The recording echoed in the room. The plotting, the threats, the talk of overthrowing the council. The air grew thick with murmurs and shifting bodies. "What is this?" Lucien asked. His voice steady, but his fingers tightening on the edge of the table betrayed him. "Oh, just a taste of the conversations you hoped no one would hear," I said, keeping my voice steady. "But wait, there's more." I gestured to Agatha, who stepped forward and laid out the documents she'd managed to dig up. Proof of deals, threats, even evidence of missing people. "This isn't just a nightclub," I said, raising my voice. "And it's not just a meeting spot, it's a power play. Lucien's been using all of you to build his own empire. Not to protect the supernatural community, he's been using me, too. Framing me, so no one would look too closely at what he's really doing." The room buzzed with tension. Creatures whispered to each other, some standing, some sitting stiffly. Eyes turned to Lucien, who slowly rose from his seat. "Miss Darrow," he began, a small, tight smile on his face. "You have a vivid imagination. It's a shame you've been manipulated by the council into thinking I'm your enemy. You see, they're the ones who—" "Don't," Agatha interrupted, her voice calm but commanding. "We've got everything we need, Lucien. You can't spin your way out of this. These people," she nodded toward the crowd, "deserve the truth, not more lies." Lucien's smile faded, and his gaze flicked from me to Agatha, then to the room around him. He must have realized he'd lost control because his voice grew sharper. "The council doesn't care about any of you," he snapped, his composure breaking. "They're the real threat. If you want to keep living in their shadow—" "Enough!" one of the vampires at the table barked, rising to their feet. "You lied to us, Lucien. Used us." Another voice joined in, and then another, until the room was filled with rising anger. Lucien took a step back, his silver eyes darting to the exits. He was cornered, and he knew it. Agatha stepped forward, her steady presence cutting through the noise. "It's over, Lucien. You can fight, or you can face the council and take responsibility for what you've done." And just like that, the tension hit its peak. A sudden silence fell as figures shifted at the edges of the room. I turned to see the council arriving. Not a word spoken, just the silent weight of their authority filling the space. Lucien's closest allies stood, glancing from him to the council. One by one they stepped back, leaving him alone. His hands clenched into fists, but there was no one left to defend him. When the council finally spoke, their voices were calm, measured. They approached Lucien and he didn't resist as they took him into custody. The room slowly began to clear out, creatures disappearing into the shadows, some whispering, some shaking their heads. Agatha let out a long breath beside me. "Well, that was dramatic." I gave her a tired smile. "You can say that again." As we walked out of the eclipse for what I hoped was the last time, I felt a strange mix of relief and exhaustion. Lucian was finally exposed. My name might finally be clear. But part of me couldn't help but wonder, if this was what we could see, what else was still lurking in the dark? Once the dust settled, I threw myself into writing. I wasn't just telling my story. I was telling the story. I wrote about the secret gatherings, the whispered plans, the supernatural council. I wrote about Lucien's betrayal, about how he'd tried to use me as a scapegoat. Every late night and early morning went into that exposé. By the end, my fingers felt like they'd been glued to the keyboard. Of course, the council didn't exactly roll out the red carpet when they heard what I'd written. A stern-faced envoy showed up at my door before I even hit publish. "This cannot go public," she said, her tone colder than a snowstorm. "For the sake of everyone involved." I tried to argue, but she wasn't having it. They were firm. The supernatural world stayed in the shadows. They made it clear that my little tell-all wasn't going to end up on any bestseller list. Still, it wasn't a total loss. My story spread within their circles. The creatures who'd once eyed me with suspicion now whispered my name with a mix of respect and caution. I'd become a kind of legend among them. Not bad for a journalist who just wanted a drink. A week after everything blew over, I stopped by Agatha's office. She was hunched over her desk, as usual, sipping tea from her favorite mug. She looked up as I came in, her face breaking into a rare smile. "Cass," she said, "to what do I owe the honor?" I dropped into the chair across from her. "I just wanted to say thanks," I said. "You didn't have to help me, but you did, and I'll never forget that." She waved me off, but I could see the hint of a grin tugging at her lips. "Don't get mushy on me now, it's my job, remember?" "Yeah, but you didn't have to do it so well," I replied, giving her a playful wink. She chuckled softly and set down her pen. "I'll admit, I didn't expect things to get so weird. I knew there were secrets in this city, but I didn't realize how deep they ran. Supernatural factions, councils, people, things hiding in plain sight. It's a lot to take in." I nodded, leaning back in my chair. "Tell me about it." But honestly, knowing all that's out there, it kind of makes the world feel bigger, you know? Like there's more to discover. Agatha raised her tea in a mock toast. "Well, here's to not discovering too much more. I like my world manageable," I laughed, shaking my head. "Sure, Agatha, I'll try not to bring you any more chaos." As I left her office and headed home, the streets felt different, quieter maybe. Or maybe I was just too tired to notice the usual city buzz. When I finally stepped into my apartment, all I wanted was a hot shower and some sleep. But when I walked over to my desk, I froze. There, on the smooth wood surface, was a single piece of paper. I didn't leave it there. Someone else did. My pulse quickened as I picked it up and read the words scrawled across it in bold, sharp handwriting. "You're in deeper than you know." My eyes darted to the window. I caught a glimpse of a shadowy figure in the alley below. Just for a moment, before it melted into the darkness. My throat tightened. I wasn't sure who left the note or what it meant, but one thing was clear. This wasn't over. I sank into my chair and stared at the blank notebook sitting in front of me. After a long moment, I picked up a pen and wrote a single line on the first page. "Lair of shadows, the truth beneath." If they thought I was going to stop now, they didn't know me at all.